Welcome to the John Carter Brown Library. My name is Neil Safier, and I'm the director and librarian of the library. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this virtual launch for the digital first exhibition entitled Constellations, Reimagining Celestial Histories in the Early Americas. We are broadcasting today directly from the John Carter Brown Library, at least I am, under very cloudy skies and in fact, quite a lot of snow, which are not particularly advantageous conditions for stargazing. But we have a stellar cast today that are actually ranging from Cambridge, England to Mexico City. And I look forward to introducing them in just a moment. For those of you who may be familiar or unfamiliar with the John Carter Brown Library, this particular collection was started in the mid-19th century by a descendant of one of the most important merchant families of New England. John Carter Brown chose to dedicate the last 2 decades of his life to his great passion, collecting books about the history of the Americas, all of the Americas, from Greenland to Patagonia and beyond. His widow, Sophia Augusta Brown, continued his legacy following his death in 1874 by adding some spectacular volumes to the collection, including one of the finest Shakespeare folios currently in any library anywhere in the world. His son, John Nicholas Brown, added maps and atlases and an array of spectacular Mexican materials to his father's collection. When he died in 1900, his testament bequeathed the entire collection to an institution that would care for it in perpetuity. That was determined by his trustees to be Brown University, and where it moved in 1904 into a neoclassical building on the Brown campus, where it has been ever since. Like everyone, we have been challenged by the coronavirus pandemic. But since the library has weathered many challenges before in its almost 175-year history, our staff has risen to the occasion and has leaned into our digital profile. Digitization has allowed us to make all of our materials available to anyone in the world, anywhere that they have internet access and can use them. This has been a tremendous collective effort by all parts of the library staff. Without naming everyone involved, let me simply thank the extraordinary cataloging department, our digitization team, our digital engagement staff, the members of our academic programming, curatorial, and administrative staff, and others, including the technical and media services group helping us today, for their heroic work in these truly exceptional and difficult times. Now, bad weather, certainly in New England, never hindered colonial astronomers either, nor did it hinder our 2 intrepid starry messengers, Nydia Pineda and Thomás Haddad, who are the special guest curators for the exhibition that we are going to see presented today. Before I introduce them, let me give a little bit of background to what this exhibition is and why it's happening here. In truth, this exhibition is the 5th and final segment of a 4-part exhibition that the library has been embarked upon for the past years, several years. A series on early environmental history at the John Carter Brown Library. Which relates to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. We realized that one thing that was missing from this 4 elements series was, in fact, the celestial sphere, the sphere that brought it all together. As if on cue, as if heavenly ordained, in fact, I met Nydia Pineda, who is a specialist of astronomical images, in a cartography conference in Brazil. Later, she became a short-term fellow at the John Carter Brown Library. Coincidentally, at the same time that Nydia was carrying out her fellowship, a Brazilian scholar of early astronomy, Thomás Haddad, was also in residence. The two immediately began conspiring and seeking common interests in order to hatch a project that has really come to fruition over the course of the last 2 years. First, at a meeting in Mexico City organized by Nydia and her colleagues at the UNAM in Mexico, and last spring, right before the lockdown, when Nydia, Thomás, and I co-taught a course on the history of the scientific book in the Americas through the library's Watts program in the history and culture of the Americas. I take particular pride that Nydia and Thomás are scholars who come from countries where the JCB has a particularly important collection, Mexico and Brazil, but they are, without question, internationally renowned scholars in their own right. Thomás Haddad is professor of history at the University of Sao Paulo and a specialist in the history of early modern astronomy in the Americas. And Nydia Pineda is assistant professor of history and the history of science at the University of California, San Diego. We have the special privilege today of being joined also by Simon Schaffer, professor of the history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. Professor Schaffer is a native of Southampton in England, but spent the first 10 years of his life in Australia. And you probably can't see it, but right behind me are some books that are the Italian translation of Captain Cook's Circumnavigation. So we already have encapsulated here some of the global aspirations of this library and of astronomy in the early modern period. Returning to England, Simon received a degree in the natural sciences at the University of Cambridge. He also went on to study at Harvard, at the University of Cambridge, where he received his PhD, and he has taught at many institutions, both in the UK and also UCLA, as well as in France. Simon is perhaps best known for a work that he co-authored with Stephen Chapin in 1985, entitled Leviathan and the Air Pump, a work that I coincidentally had the privilege to read as an undergraduate here at Brown University in 1990, 30 years ago, in a class taught by historian of science, Joan Richards. Simon is also known within the profession as an author of incisive, perspicacious, and often brilliant essays and articles that are models, I know, for the three of us, Thomás, Nydia, and I, who aspire to write early modern history with an eye toward contemporary socio-cultural critique. So with those introductions, I want to just say quickly how this is going to work today. First, we will have a guided tour from Thomás and Nydia, who will run through some of the highlights and the context of the exhibition. We will then turn to Simon, who will respond and react to some of the most interesting features of the exhibition. All the while, we will leave the Q&A open so that you can ask questions, which I will moderate when we turn to the question and answer period at the end of our time together. So once again, let me thank you very much for joining us. We're very excited about this extremely important exhibition, and we look forward to hearing about it from Nydia and Thomás. And with that, I turn things over to you.
Many thanks, Neil, for this generous introduction, and also many thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Nydia and I are truly happy and excited about this session. And before we start, we'd like to express our deepest gratitude to several persons who've made all this possible. First to you, Neil, who invited us to undertake this adventure and supported us every step of the way. Also, many thanks to our colleagues in the JCB staff, Tara Kingsley and Pedro Leal, with whom we've been working closely over the last few months. Thanks to John Minichello, Dana Darvik, Alison Rich, Val Andrews, Ian Graham, Mary Mott, Jose Montelongo, Domingo Ledesma, Bertie Mandelblatt, and every single member of the staff at the JCB. Without you, this exhibition would not be possible. And thank you so much for your hard work.
I also want to thank our wonderful partners in computer science at IMA, SUNAM, Mérida, who are developing the interactive digital platform for the exhibition that will be launched very soon. Maria del Carmen Jorge has greatly facilitated this institutional collaboration on the Mexican side. Antonio Neme is leading a group of brilliant programmers that have really made this project their own. Thanks so much to Sergio Ivan Mota, Alejandro Garcia, and Santiago Rodriguez for their ideas and hard work. And please stay tuned for the launch of this platform. Thank you to Virginia Yomi, Andres Vélez, Laura Bland, Ana Diaz, Franco Rossi, Guillaume Candela, Alfonso Vite, for sharing their research and for starring in the videos that will be released on the exhibition website over the next months. And thank you especially to Sabrina Almandoz, Lalo Santoyo, and Hugo Magaña for the technical and artistic production of the videos. This could be very long. We are very, very grateful to the participants of the upcoming events in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and to the authors of the special exhibition labels that will be launched through the coming weeks and months. And a very, very special thank you to Simon Schaffer for being here. It's very, very special for us. And on a very personal note, I want to thank Thomás for being a great colleague. Best.
And I want to thank you, Nydia. It's also very special for me to have worked by your side for so many months, and I hope we keep doing this for a long time. Over time, all across the early Americas, people raised their eyes to the skies in search of many different things. They gazed at the stars to look for signs, answers, wonder, and solace. The heavens offered them a means of finding their place in the world or securing a place for themselves in their own communities. The motions of celestial bodies allowed people to keep track of time and organize their lives, as well as to predict the future or understand the past. Early American eyes also turned down to the pages where people wrote and read about the skies. These pages were filled with words in any number of languages, with drawings and numbers and signs, but also with desires, hopes, and fears, with poetry, ecstasy, and sarcasm. We can still read in these pages words that were preached in sermons or spoken in classrooms, and we can look at the images that depicted things that were seen or imagined. Some of the books in which those pages were bound were kept in libraries, while others were carried in pockets. They were discussed in vibrant colonial cities or were taken along solitary journeys to the vast interiors of the continent. Constellations is an exhibition about those books and also maps and manuscripts, but even more so about the people who wrote, possessed, read, and studied them over the dark nights and bright days of the Americas.
Well, the delight of dealing with these objects, material and virtual, is undeniably at the core of our curatorial work, but we have to say that there's also a historiographic intervention. This exhibition is not a history of astronomy that tells the progressive accumulation of knowledge through instrumentation that is considered increasingly accurate. This is not a history of the passive reception of European ideas and practices in the Americas. And finally, this is not a project to unearth what might be thought of as indigenous astronomy. We want to highlight an important argument that runs through this exhibition. So, astronomy is a form of knowledge closely tied to beliefs and practices and certain groups of people. It's a form of knowledge that explains, organizes, regulates, and represents time and space in a purportedly universal way but it is actually closely tied to institutions, spaces, practices, and people that hold epistemic and political authority. Astronomy is thought of as tame, as a contemplative discipline, but in many ways it isn't.
Astronomy was also an instrument for making, writing, inventing a history of the Americas that could be then incorporated into the history, economy, and practices of the Christian world. In the early Americas, astronomy cohabited with other ways of understanding the relationship between the sky and the earth, time and space. Those other forms of experiencing the heavens are very frequently silenced in colonial books. We have not pretended to revive that knowledge in this exhibition, but we have attempted to point at the different roles of astronomy in the colonial experience.
Now, what kind of objects have we selected from the JCB collections for this exhibition? Many of them are books, maps, or images that are easily relatable to the idea of astronomy. However, other objects have been selected precisely because they are not usually associated with the history of that discipline. And in one case or the other, our guiding principle has been to select materials that were actually read, used, or made by people who lived in the Americas, in the early Americas, and not lavish objects of prestige. Some of our choices are rare or little known books. Some objects appeal to us for their material characteristics, yet others surprised and moved us in deeply personal ways. In any case, what you are going to see in this exhibition are objects that circulated in the Americas, were found in colonial libraries, and were written or read by early American people.
Now we want to give you a small glimpse of the objects that are part of the exhibition and the way we have chosen to organize them. Learning to read the skies for knowing one's place in the cosmos and the earth was an integral part of the culture of mariners who crossed the Atlantic back and forth, of writers who wanted to make sense of the relation between the old and the new world, and of the curricula of educational institutions that ranged from grammar schools to universities, religious colleges, and military academies. In the early Americas, this kind of astronomical knowledge was constantly translated, put to different uses, and conveyed in a variety of ways through navigational manuals, textbooks, treatises, dissertations, maps, or even as part of religious and historical works.
Instruments for stargazing aroused awe, desire, curiosity, obsession, distrust, and speculation. These fragile objects represented in books engaged the body, reason, memory, and imagination. But instruments were also related with the creation of authority and strategies of legitimation in local and global contexts. They were conditioned by local resources and practices and by colonial asymmetries. Astronomical practitioners living in the Americas had very conflicting attitudes towards instruments for navigation, for timekeeping, geography, earthquake, or meteorological predictions, as all these objects were commonly linked to personal or national pride.
These same colonial intellectuals engaged in vigorous philosophical disputations about the nature of heavenly phenomena. Disputes in print were tokens of political allegiances, strategies for social mobility and accrual of prestige, and also attempts at reasserting or undermining existing social orders. European philosophical traditions about the skies were not passively received and adopted, but they were actively transformed, reinvented, rejected, and deployed in local fights over the meaning of comets, eclipses, or meteors that were generated and solved in their own terms. Celestial phenomena were intimately connected to time. They marked the seasons and the tides, the time to seed or to harvest, days of market and court, the time to sleep or to wake up, holy or ordinary days. Working across class, gender, and racial divides, almanacs and other ephemeral materials were read, annotated, and passed among several hands each year. Readers occasionally continued to take note of important events in their lives decades after the information in the almanacs had expired. Communities resorted to the heavens to organize the present and invent the future.
And the skies were also used to invent and regulate the past. Astronomy was used to include or exclude inhabitants of the early Americas from Christian history. For the Europeans that crossed the Atlantic, the Christian calendar, regulated by astronomical time, was not only a timekeeping instrument, but the basis of history itself. The time of creation and salvation were the beginning and end of human action, and history could only be told according to the astral frameworks that supported that narrative. Colonial intellectuals created meeting points between indigenous and European modes of computing, time, and memory keeping. And really, writing the history of the New World meant recovering or recreating the so-called astronomical knowledge of the most ancient inhabitants of the land.
The conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity was the ultimate ideological justification of the European invasion and colonization of the New World. Missionary activity in the early Americas shaped colonial societies and territories in every conceivable way. In their day-to-day work, Christian missionaries resorted to their privileged knowledge of indigenous languages and frequently employed astronomical references in order to access indigenous peoples' belief systems. Conversion was not limited, however, to gaining new souls to the Christian faith, but it also meant policing the behavior and beliefs of large populations of European ancestry who were already among the faithful. For this end, preachers and religious authors made use of remarkable celestial phenomena to inspire reverence or to claim that the stars revealed some kind of special divine protection for the Americas.
How have we organized these objects? Are our constellation fixed arguments or categories or classifications? The short answer is no. Though you will find 10 different constellations in our display, 5 of which are now visible on the JCB website, it's important to keep in mind that these are subjective groupings, really shaped by our findings and intuitions. The clusters are inspired by our interest in seeing objects from different parts of Europe and the Americas, which are not commonly treated together in a shared space. We wanted to compare and contrast local histories as well. We wanted to see technology, religion, and poetry together. It has not been easy to find these connections, and we're constantly reorganizing, reshaping our sky. But we do want you to know that this exhibition is also our commitment to embracing unstable orders of knowledge that are constantly open to new interpretations.
I'd like to start by thanking everyone involved in this, especially, of course, Thomás and Nydia and the John Carter Brown Library, embodied in the person of its director and its brilliant staff, for having arranged this very remarkable exhibition, and also having juxtaposed, as you've already gathered from that video and commentary, that very rich video and commentary, the most remarkable set of constellations that any observer from the old world has ever managed to experience. So I'm in a rare and somewhat strange position, because astronomically I occupy Greenwich Mean Time, so I'm somewhat ahead, but in every other conceivable respect, far, far behind the library and the curators of this exhibition. So stumbling along, I've been invited to offer some early and rather privileged response to the contents of the exhibition and to its aims, and perhaps even some of its lessons. Well, I guess the obvious way of responding is to attend to the name of the exhibition. That seems rather literal-minded, but let's do that. There are some obvious relationships between astronomical constellations and what's on show here at JCB. Constellations distribute stellar objects by convention. There's nothing natural about constellations. Indeed, the constellations by which astronomers now live were only really formalized in the 19th century from North America. It will perhaps not surprise you to learn. And before then, there were enormous disputes between astronomers, astrologers, and many others about what stars belonged where. So assignation, questions of territoriality, questions of who belonged where precisely, were fought out between the advocates of different constellations, just as they were fought out on this planet. The theme that strikes an amateur observer of the exhibition like myself is the way that it prompts the thought, Nydia has already referred to this, that instruments are awesome and that astronomy is not tame. It's not mainly about contemplation, and instruments are not mainly machinery simply for delivering numbers. Rather, as you've already heard, there are issues of legitimacy in play here. You see this magnificently in Amerigo Vespucci's letter to the Medici of March 1503, in which he describes his, quote, discovery, unquote, of the Southern Cross, represented in this early 17th century Antwerp print, and in which he asserts his own legitimacy. And notice what he's doing. The legitimacy partly comes from text and partly from instrument. The two resources are assimilated, one to t'other. So on the one hand, Dante's prophecy that in the southern pole, in the other pole, there will be 4 stars. And on the other hand, Vespucci's mastery of instruments for taking altitudes, the quadrant and the astrolabe, known to all. These have been used by me with much honor. So there's a little triangle in the show between legitimacy and instrument and inscription. And it's important, I think, to remember what the term legitimacy, legitimo, actually meant in the period with which the exhibition is concerned. It meant three different and closely related things. It meant law-like, conforming to the rules, normal, regular, standardized, precisely the enterprise of certain versions of early modern astronomy. To say that early modern astronomy was about legitimation was in that sense uncontroversial. Secondly, perhaps a little more interesting, legitimacy meant existence. To be legitimate was to really exist, to be genuine, not spurious, to have an appearance which was trustworthy, to show things as they are, WYSIWYG. In the world of legitimacy, what you see is what you get. And thirdly, it was in the late 16th and early 17th century that in most European languages, the word legitimate came to mean not being a bastard. It meant being born of parents lawfully married. It meant the principle of hereditary right. And those three senses are closely connected in the astronomical world. This is surely the most important example in the exhibition and in the history of astronomy in the Americas of the relation between astronomy and legitimacy. Octavio Paz, great Mexican Nobel laureate, poet, novelist, writer, journalist, analyst, worked on the poems, consulted and studied and wrote about the poems and the career of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz from at least 1950. One of his first articles, as is well known, on her life and her verse, was published in the journal Sur in Paris in that year, 1950, around about the tercentenary of her birth. He lectured on her at Harvard. He was massively concerned with the work of restitution and the work of metaphor surrounding her quite remarkable literary and erudite achievements. And of course, these poemas of the 10th Muse appear in this exhibition. In his monograph on her in 1982, Octavio Paz writes what might be, as it were, the counter-epigraph for the exhibition. I quote, "Stars and constellations combine in celestial space to trace figures, signs, and forms. The starry sky is a language. As old as astrology, this metaphor has marked our civilization," he writes. "It has been sign and design. Sign is design," he continues, "and the sentences written by the stars are humanity's history." Thus Octavio Paz. His argument was that Sor Juana's learning made her legitimate. She was born illegitimate. And that, perhaps over psychological, over personal reading, as you see in the various extracts that he, Paz, chose to quote from her praise plays in honor of the birthday of the king, Charles II, she uses early modern astronomy clearly as a source of metaphor, but precisely as a source of legitimacy. It's not, in other words, just that her learning made her legitimate, whatever one thinks of that claim. This was a form of learning and practice that was designed to produce legitimacy. In the Tovar Codex, which marvelously is also part of the exhibition, this absolutely extraordinary document compiled and assembled with the Jesuit Juan de Tovar, perhaps the first American-born Jesuit, who initially compiled a work on Nahua and Aztec learning and tradition in the 1570s, sent it to Spain, where it, of course, disappeared or was impounded, and then resuscitated the project at Tula in 1585, passing it on to his fellow Jesuit Acosta in 1587, who used it as a remarkably important source for his own work. We have these extraordinarily sophisticated and intriguing and important images of the disposition of time, of history, of memory, a hybrid version of calendrical astronomy, which mixes together that tradition with Christian festivals, with Dominical letters, and so on. In other words, the work of even calendar astronomy, which might seem innocent, which might precisely seem tame, was one of the most important enterprises where the question of legitimation, the question of the order of the heavens, and the question of the new world were all co-present. That stayed true throughout the period covered by the exhibition. Of course it did. I juxtapose here an image very familiar in my town to an image taken from a very striking work on the left in the exhibition. The work on the right is the frontispiece to the first English version of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica of 1729. The work on the left, made in Paris in 1756, is the frontispiece of the 9th section of an epic verse by Anne-Marie du Bocage, great feminist indeed, female writer of the Parisian Golden Age, who had already translated John Milton's Paradise Lost into rather fine French verse, and here represents a conversation, fairly fraught one, it must be said, between Christopher Columbus and a disembodied celestial spirit who reveals to Columbus what the future of the world will be after his voyages. And in particular, she's keen on teaching him astronomy. She reveals to him the perhaps heartbreaking news that the globe was badly known by the ancients, that the sun, rather not the earth, is at the center of the world, that doctrine would be discovered more or less in his lifetime by a German, and that while this might be hard to understand, an astronomical model, she goes on, will teach you. The sphere I carry will explain this problem to you. Now, the relation between Columbus and that version of unveiling and the New World is, of course, a trope of great significance in various astronomical and astrohistorical representations of the material on show in this quite remarkable exhibition. The most familiar version of this, which we've already had a sight of, is the story that Columbus, you see it here in Flammarion's great popular astronomy text of 1879, the story that allegedly on the 29th of February, 1504, wrecked on the shore of Jamaica at the harbor of Santa Gloria, his vessels, the Capitana and the Bermuda, barely, if at all, seaworthy. Columbus consulted an almanac in order to see that there would be a total eclipse, from which he, on the one hand, was able to terrify the Taino so much with his astronomical expertise, his cosmological power, that they continued to provide his isolated crew with food. And on the other hand, using the time of the eclipse and the almanac available to him, he was able to calculate the precise position of the harbor of Santa Gloria west from Cadiz. one of the very first longitude calculations carried out by a European mariner in what they thought of as the New World. The almanac that he was using was no doubt this one, Abraham ben Shmuel Zakut's Perpetual Almanac. This is the JCB, the John Carter Brown copy, the Venice version of 1502. A man who'd become the royal astronomer, having compulsorily departed Spain, of course, in 1492 for Lisbon. The almanac was not only taken by Columbus, it was also taken by Vasco da Gama. And in 1504, Zacuto used his astronomical calculations to write a definitive history of the Jewish people, published in Tunis, where he'd taken refuge. In other words, the various constellations that this exhibition proposes for our delectation and fascination are really present in the early modern astronomy that it proposes to make available to us. The relation between instrument and inscription, and the function of that relation in terms of the establishment of legitimate power, capability, and rule is quite evident. Previous scholars have made a great deal of this, it must be said. Thomás and Nydia have, of course, based their work on prior studies of how early modern astronomy works. But what I think is striking about this exhibition is precisely the juxtapositions that it allows. The magnificent and important work by Diego Garcia de Palacio, the nautical instruction made in Mexico in 1587, reminds us already of the way in which dialogues, this was written as a dialogue between two Basque mariners. It was written by an official, a legal official, who was responsible for the administration of Guatemala and eventually Yucatan. It was written by someone who was not only a legal official, but also a naval architect, contributing to the welfare of the Manila fleet. This work offers, as you see here in this magnificent diagram, quite literally rules of thumb. Here is a paper instrument, a way of calculating the difference between the lunar and the length of the lunar and the solar year for each year stretching far, far into the future by using instructions put down in print, turned into dialogic form, and therefore given legitimacy. One can ask, it's a very interesting question for me in particular, why print a rule of thumb? If the rule works, then it would have been transmitted tacitly through embodied knowledge, and yet here it's formalized. It's formalized in order to give it legitimacy under the heading of some kind of instrument. And the same is true of the almanacs and guides and maps and works of cosmography with which the exhibition is populated. Pedro Núñez's great version of Sacrobosco, the treatise of the sphere, which needs, I think, to be juxtaposed with his invention of what we now anachronistically call the vernier scale, the nonius. Here's one of the very few, if perhaps the only surviving version of a nonius scale. It's held in the Galileo Museum in Florence, in the Medici collection, derived from the Dudley collection. And it's those inscribed concentric lines which join the outside scale, the edge of this quadrant, to the inner curve of the quadrant that allowed unprecedentedly accurate measurements of the altitude of celestial bodies above the horizon to be made. That's a form of inscription. The juxtaposition between this inscription of 1537 and this contemporary and slightly later version of writing, inscribing on metal, needs, I think, to be borne in mind when, as I hope you will, you tour the exhibition. And there are paper instruments, volvels, as in these from Appian's cosmography book made in Antwerp in 1548, where instruments equipped with paper and string on the page allow calculations of the length of twilight or the height of the pole. The way in which maps like these, which show lines of constant compass bearing, are simultaneously supposed to work as instruments and supposed to work as images, they clearly could never have in fact been used shipboard. They were instead surely and principally legitimation exercises for men at court and for other curious, genteel, and erudite readers. But finally, we need to think about the way, and Nydia has already spoken of this, in which almanacs were both inscriptions and instruments. Surely one of the most moving, one of the most significant almanacs on show in the exhibition is the range of copies of Benjamin Banneker's almanac printed in Baltimore for the middle of the 1790s, born in Maryland in 1731 as a child of free people of color, patronized in every sense of that word by the neighboring mill-owning Quaker family, the Ellicotts, as is well known, I'm sure well known to many people in this opening ceremony. Banneker's production of these almanacs was treated as a way of legitimating the intelligence of people of color. They flatter themselves, say the editors of this almanac, that a philanthropic public in this enlightened era will be induced to give their patronage and support to this work, not only on account of its intrinsic merit, it having met the approbation of several of the most distinguished astronomers in America, but from similar motives to those which induced the editors to give this calculation the preference, the ardent desire of drawing modest merit from obscurity and, I quote, controverting the long-established illiberal prejudice. In other words, as a contemporary 1790s verse put it, on record now thy name's enrolled, and future ages will be told, there lived a man called Banneker, an African astronomer. There are ways then in which the legitimation function of the combination of astronomical instrumentation and astronomical print, of inscription and hardware, had highly ambiguous, highly compromised, entertaining, important, but also difficult, violent consequences. And I think one should remember that when one tours the exhibition. I can't resist closing with this image. This is an image made right at the end of the Second World War in Brussels by Hergé in his Prisoners of the Sun, his racist, hierarchical, legitimating exercise in the analysis of South American tradition and European triumphalism. One might note that this is Professor Calculus in Anglo-American, but he is, of course, Professor Tournesol, Sunflower, the Sun Watcher in France and Belgium. He has no idea what's going on. We notice that Captain Haddock, who is Haddock both in English and French, believes this successful prediction of an eclipse to be sorcery. He's in exactly the same, shall we say, epistemic condition as the Quechua who are fleeing in ignorance, as Hergé has it, from this appalling event. Only the white savior with the almanac on his side is in command. Only his knowledge is legitimate. In order to make it legitimate, he has to pretend to be an Inca priest, but the implied reader is invited to suppose that we and only we, this is 1945, know what's really going on. Perhaps I'm taking Tintin too seriously. I'm not sure it's possible to take Tintin too seriously. Perhaps it's just an example of the entertainment, the humor, and the wit of Hergé, but above all, the possibilities for entertainment and pure joy that await you as you tour this extraordinarily rich exhibition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, for that extraordinary tour and extraordinary reaction to what indeed is a set of extraordinary texts. And you have really contributed in a spectacular way to what is already, and for the audience we'll see, is a really spectacular set of reflections. There are questions already coming in to the chat. I will be moderating them, and I think one of the first questions that came in, which I think is a very straightforward question, but one that bears examination, is simply the distinction between astrology and astronomy, and whether one or both were used in the early Americas in particular. And this also opens up the distinction of whether or not there were terms that were used in Europe at the time that were not used in the Americas and vice versa.
Well, perhaps I can say something about this. Astrology and astronomy, this distinction was invented over time in the Americas, in Europe, and this distinction was shifting. It was, I would say that at times it didn't exist. At times, imposing a distinction like this served important purposes for the people who were trying to create or to defend the existence of such a distinction. But anyway, the question about the use of astronomy and astrology, or more precisely, whether they were used in the Americas, yes, they were, all across the Americas. We find astrological texts in this way, many times undistinguishable from what one would today call astronomical texts. Astrology is present in almanacs, in medical books, in natural histories, in all genres, in all kinds of texts. Astronomy was at times repressed by astrology, was at times repressed by religious authorities. At times it was promoted by them. So this is an incredibly rich field that we can, well, we can, and some people do this marvelously, spend a lifetime studying how this distinction was produced and what purposes it served.
I just say that one of the most unexpected, perhaps, aspects of the curatorial process was finding astrology everywhere. Horoscopes, all different types of astrological images, and shared vocabularies, really. There's a great part of astrology is observation and understanding the past, not just the future. So it's very interesting how this kind of discourse can adapt to different genres and speak to different audiences in the early Americas.
I just have a couple of short thoughts. One is, it's fantastically anachronistic to make a distinction between astrology and astronomy for the period, well, for most of the period that's covered by the exhibition. What happens in culture and the sciences right at the end of the period covered by this exhibition is, as it were, the production of astrology as something separate in retrospect by astronomers and other actors going back over the extraordinary material we have in the exhibition and doing a job of triage and saying, look, this is astrological and this is not. And that distinction is, as it were, the retrospective result of what is about to happen in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Right? So the answer to the question, were both used in early Americas, is obviously yes, because they are so entangled that distinguishing between them, exactly as Nydia has just said, is really very difficult indeed. Two brief riders to that. One is, I indulged myself by quoting Octavio Paz on Sor Juana. If you want an example of the integration of astronomy with astrology, her verse, and above all her drama, her luas, are amazing examples of that. And in a very interesting way, because she makes, for example, in one of the passages that I showed you that's in the exhibition, right? She has the personification of the sun, S-U-N, Sol, who speaks to the audience and explains that the sun's power, the planet's power over our wills, is dispositional and not necessary. We are left with free will, but our world is dominated, says Sol, by influence. And if you neglect influence, you won't understand the way the world works. If you claim that you only did this because of your stars, our fault is in ourselves, Horatio, not in our stars that we are under them, then you're a hypocrite. So she completely weaves those two together, only in this fascinating way to separate them. That's a very long-winded way of saying to Janet, anyway, yes.
So we have a wide variety of questions that have come in now that relate to the, what we might call the encounter between European astronomical practices and beliefs and Native or American, or in any case, non-European practices. One of the questions that comes from Louisiana, from an observer that we are glad to know has survived the hurricane, that actually hurricanes that have passed that way in the last several weeks, last name of Kelman, asks what was the attitude in general toward early Spanish colonial astronomers toward the Aztec or other astronomies that they encounter. What did they do with it? How did they react to it? And interestingly, there are some other questions as well, whether, in fact, from Joan Richards, whether the astronomical knowledge that they found was actually in conflict with European interpretations or not. So perhaps, Nydia, would you like to take a first stab at that and then pass it along to Thomás and Simon?
Firstly, I think it's important to widen the idea of early astronomers, or astronomers in the 16th or the 17th or 18th century. The knowledge of the skies and celestial observation was made by people who were not necessarily astronomers. So many missionaries or civil servants obeying royal decrees for instance, the observation of lunar eclipses around the viceroyalties, or captains who were not necessarily astronomers, mariners, but they had the knowledge. So that's the first thing I think. We have to think widely, that looking at the skies and understanding some periodic movements for timekeeping or for geographical representations, that was widely practiced. However, the astronomers who called themselves astronomers, in many ways, did follow a curricula shared in Salamanca, I would say. And it's very interesting because there's a great combination of theories, I think, in their discourses. And they also, I'm thinking, for instance, of Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora. He was also an antiquarian. He was a royal cosmographer, but also an antiquarian. And he was very interested in understanding indigenous timekeeping and map making, etc. And I think here there is an issue that we discussed with Simon before this meeting about the idea of degeneration. So the idea that indigenous astronomy was properly astronomy before the conquest, and then it was lost. And the colonial astronomers didn't really have access to that lost indigenous knowledge. And so they wanted to recreate it and reclaim it in order to build some kind of national pride.
No, I'd like to defer to Simon, because I was thinking exactly of this conversation of ours and this idea of, let's say, a golden past of astronomy, and the idea of going back to it. And Simon, I'm sure, has very interesting and perhaps surprising things to say about how widespread this idea was, not only across the Americas, but apparently European empires in the Enlightenment were very keen on pursuing this idea of a shared common past.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, isn't it? I think scholars and researchers like me, who know absolutely nothing about the Americas whatsoever, have a huge amount to learn from the kind of material that John Carter Brown and your scholarship and so on is bringing to light and making us think about. What Thomás and Nydia are referring to is as follows, that if you look, say, at, I mean, I wouldn't look too closely because it's pretty disgusting, but if you look at British colonial scholarship on the Sanskritic tradition in the astral sciences in the 18th century, or the encounters between European missionaries and Chinese scholars from the late 16th, early 17th century onwards, you see, perhaps not surprisingly, rather similar kinds of claims. And to be very simple, perhaps oversimple, the thought was that in encountering these great traditions, European scholars reckoned that what they were encountering was a degenerate form of an original globally distributed astral science. And that this astral science had only survived in its perfect, complete form, surprisingly enough, in Western Europe. That was the European idea. And in every other part of the world, it had degenerated. Now, what's the implication of that claim? The implication of that claim is that meant that colonial scholars could legitimately engage in exchanges with indigenous experts Secondly, that they would treat those indigenous experts with enormous condescension. And thirdly, that it was as if invading European aggressors were actually returning, not arriving, to the territories that they were occupying. And this is explicit in British writings about Sanskrit astronomy in South Asia. The argument is that, as it were, South Asian Buddhists are basically Copernicans. And therefore, what's going on when Copernican astronomers reach Calcutta from Cambridge is a return to that land of the true learning. So as a form of legitimation of imperial conquest, exploitation, and violence, that was a really important argument. I don't know whether one sees similar kinds of arguments in Castilian, Lusophone, and other versions of indigenous astronomical expertise in the Americas. Sometimes this relies so much on written records that issues of the status of the codexes, of the codices, become moot. I mean, for example, the most important source there is for Mayan astronomy, the Madrid Codex, wasn't even known about until the late 1800s in Europe. It was made in the 15th century in Yucatan, and then it disappears. And then it reappears in the late 1800s in Madrid. And it's an extraordinary document. It's a set of almanacs and horoscopes, which provide the basis of much of what is now known about Mayan constellations, for example. So there are questions of textual transmission there. But the basic point about degeneration is, I think, absolutely linked, certainly to the question of what that Joan is raising here. The challenges to European versions, and especially to Newtonianism. It would take us too long to go into that.
There are a couple of questions, and probably more further down, about instruments and instrumentation and inscription. One by Hal Cook, who talks about the juxtaposition or intermingling or joining or tension between poetry, inscription, and instrument, and whether that is causal or casual, if you will. And then another question by Jean-François Gauvin, related to instruments used by Native Americans, the type of agency they embodied, the type of habitus necessary to use them, and then how they were interpreted. So it's a similar kind of question as earlier, but really focused around the objects that were being used. And I think one of the other contributions of the exhibition is really the kind of the narrative fluidity of these of the languages that are used to describe celestial occurrences. Anybody like to take a stab at that interconnected question?
Very interesting questions. I think one key point is that exactly as you've just said, Neil, this exhibition, it has built in a feature of fluidity. So this juxtaposition between inscriptions, instruments, and poetry that Simon highlighted wasn't, I would say, something that Nydia and I had in mind when we started this. In a way, this question allows us to think a little bit quickly about the way this exhibition was born. The constellations that give name to the exhibition, well, one of them, as you were gonna see, one of them talks about instruments, or more precisely about how instruments created anxiety or desire in American actors. There is another constellation talking about poetry, about fiction, about this metaphorical uses of astronomy. But then you can juxtapose them and perhaps create another constellation that wasn't intended to begin with. I don't know if Nydia gave more thought to this kind of juxtaposition.
I'm reading Hal's question, and I'm not sure if he's asking us of the three parts, the instrument, the poetry, and the inscription, or just inscription and instrument. I'm going to try and think of those two last ones. I think inscriptions are one of the most important instruments for astronomy. So inscriptions, and as in notation, inscriptions as in scratching the earth to see where a shadow is, inscriptions, I'm thinking of maps of the moon, for instance. There is the desire to find inscriptions on the moon, and therefore the moon becomes an instrument as well, made of inscriptions. They are necessary, one to the other. Of course, there are also instruments like rods, as Simon said to us the other day. I think from the idea of the map of the moon, we can easily find ways of jumping to poetry, but maybe Simon wants to talk more about instruments and inscriptions first.
I think there's probably too much to say here, and a couple of brief points, right? I did want to bring out, because it's absolutely remarkable in the show when people have a chance, especially using the digital tools that are being designed to explore what's on offer, right? It is remarkable to encounter these books, writings, as instrumental in all senses of that word. They are clearly tools with purposes, and many of them, as we've just argued, this in response to Hal Cook's comments, are clearly designed to be practically used. A caveat about that: overwhelmingly, if a work ends up in such a prestigious collection as the John Carter Brown Library, it can't have been used very much. If you look at the state of most of the almanacs, like the Banneker copies that we have here as well as in North America, you can see how much they were used, because they barely survived. So there is a survival question about the use of the evidence we've got. A lot of the works that we're looking at are compelling because they were presentation copies. I'm sorry, that's not for using, that's for buying and selling, right? So there is that issue. The more substantive issue, however, is I would want to emphasize, and I see from Q&A that several people are raising this question, that the connection between the instrumental and the inscribed points in both directions. It's not only, as it were, that books can be used as instruments and tools, but that instruments were for reading, they were for contemplating, right? So the device that survived from Pedro Nunez, the amazing device, the only really surviving Nonius we've got, right? Or rather the Florentines have got. That is a device for meditating on. It isn't just, perhaps not even mainly, a device for use in the technical sense, And we need to take very seriously the way in which material devices were objects of contemplation and meditation. And that is what links together fundamentally the poetics of the instrument and the use of print. Because the instrument is a meditative and contemplative as well as a pragmatic device. And you see that very well in most of the most important collections. And you see that very well in the John Carter Brown material that we've got here. But there's clearly much, much more to say about that.
So a couple of the questions also relate to the instruments that were used to create these objects in the first place as well, and whether or not, Carlos Lopez Beltran says whether the site of the publishing, whether in Europe or the Americas, created differences that were visible, that were palpable, and also Carlos Gonçalves, whether or not the draftsman who created the actual images had astronomical knowledge of the phenomena that they were creating. So I ask to Nydia and Thomás, were you able to see any distinctive signs that a book, for instance, produced in Mexico would have been different in terms of the way in which it created than something in Europe? This might be an opportune moment to, I did bring one book to show from the collection that is in the exhibition. I'll try not to angle the light in a particular way. It's a spectacular series of astronomical, really almost astronomical prognostications here that you can see, approximately 8 of them, including the only one of its kind that was, and of course I now won't be able to find it, was produced by a woman. Nydia and Thomás, you can talk about this particular here as I find it. But are there things that you were able to see or observe as you were going through this that reference the particular site of production for these astronomical instruments and books?
Perhaps a first approach to this big and important question would be, yes, the materials carry indications of their origin, but also of their custodial history, of the way they ended up in the JCB's collections. So for instance, material from early New England tends to be much more humble than material from Viceregal Mexico. The books are smaller, they have less pages. Many of them are almanacs, highly used almanacs. They are almost, disappear in our hands, extremely fragile objects. While this collection of Mexican almanacs you were just showing us, it's in pristine condition, which, well, this obviously has to do with the history of the conservation of this object. And then I think there's also material traces of origin, of production associated to genre. So almanacs, I was talking about them, they tend to be obviously pocketbooks. They are different from dissertations, which are a little bit larger. But then we have maps, we have some fantastic large scale maps, and those would demand a lot of skilled knowledge by printers, engravers, and of course they would demand an audience for them. And as to what the people who the draftsmen or even the composers of the books, the knowledge they had of subject matter? I think this is a beautiful question that takes us to very important problems in the history of the book. The question of authorship, like we have an important map of the passage of a comet that's displayed in the exhibition. And who's the author of this map? This Jesuit priest who came from Spain to Mexico, or the engraver, the printer, who's listed in the JCB catalog as the author?
First of all, that we included books that we have a certain degree of we're pretty sure that they circulated in the Americas. That's something that we were very, very careful to. That was a curatorial rationale. Now, European books on astronomy that circulated in America are expensive books. They are printed by the big publishers of Europe. In Antwerp, for instance, and a lot of the books that came into the New World came from the Antwerp presses. And so these books, well, they are made in optimal conditions for the time. Whereas local printmakers, they needed to get their own type. They needed to import their type, or they needed to make their own type. And so the circulation of journeymen is super, super important in the print culture. I mean, in the European print culture as well. But if we zoom in to the local print cultures of the Americas, we really have to understand how difficult it was to produce a book. The situation with the draftsman and astronomical images that's a great question. So because astronomical images are sometimes understood as illustrations, as direct, transparent discourses that are intended from the author and they go directly to the reader's mind. Well, that's just not the case, because the economy of print needed plates to circulate, needed images to be reused. And so the same images could be reused for completely different philosophical arguments. And the draftsmen that produced them might not have cared about those philosophical arguments, but they might have too. And so there's a story in each image that we have to look for.
There are some questions in the Q&A regarding objects in the sky, from comets to asteroids, and what were the limits of astronomical observations. And also there was an early question by our curator of Latin American books, Jose Montelongo, about fear and the different emotions that were elicited by objects in the sky. I'm wondering, and perhaps Simon will pose this to you first, if there were, what things were not visible to early modern astronomers that came later, and whether those are indigenous or European, what on the cusp of when this exhibition ends, what were people beginning to see that they didn't know were there?
That's a fantastic question. So not coincidentally, perhaps, the period roughly covered by the exhibition ends the moment there's a new planet, right? So there were no such things until 1781, and then there were. And that's extremely important. It's exceptionally important, I tried to insinuate in my ill-considered remarks about Cristobal Colon, for the image of discovery, which we haven't had time to talk about. So when William Herschel, the story is more complicated, for the first time in recorded history discovers a planet, that is absolutely extraordinary, because planets are not the kind of thing you find. All indigenous cultures this is an important thing to know, recognized all the planets. So when Spanish, Portuguese, Mayan, Dutch, British, and French astronomers and experts are in dialogue, they see the same number of objects in the sky. And then they don't, as it were. And that's quite interesting. I see that there's a question from someone who may or may not be related to you about asteroids. So the first asteroid was discovered right at the beginning of the 19th century, in January 1800. So there are no asteroids in this exhibition, at least hardly any. And by and large, they are in fact telescopic objects. And they're not visible or seen until then. So it would be interesting, first point, to meditate a bit on the relation between indigenous and European notions of the absolutely new and what astronomy provides as a site at which the absolutely new may or may not be occurring, right? The corollary of that is to do with Newtonian astronomy in the New World. Because the big deal about Newtonian astronomy, probably more than anything else, is that it claimed that comets weren't new. In other words, it reduced the number of absolutely new things in the world. That's not normally how we think about 18th century Newtonian astronomy, but that was what it meant. What it meant was that comets are like planets, they return. And that had an enormous effect in the New World, as the Europeans call it. So I think there's a story about the absolutely new and the discoverable there. There's also a story which we surely do not have time to go into because it's now 1:30, whatever. I've lost track of time. About the importance of curved glasses, of telescopes in all of this. And that's why I wanted to talk a little more about instruments. I'll just give you one example. In the Columbiad, Christopher Columbus is kidnapped by a water spirit, and she is almost on the point of allowing him to invent the telescope, and then decides not to and leave it to Galileo, because after all, Columbus can't be held to discover everything. And that's a wonderful trope because it brings together a European fantasy about the discovery of the New World with a European fantasy about the discovery of the instrument that's going to reveal the new world in the heavens. And I find that absolutely bizarre and remarkable.
There have been a few questions that have just come in the last little bit. I want to, for those people who have to leave, we understand, maybe take another 10 minutes or so just to kind of, since we're all here and this conversation is so fantastic.
One of the constellations that are not yet on view, it's our sky is going to change over time, but one of them is called Fear and Hope, exactly what Jose was asking about. And well, fear and hope immediately bring us to comets. There was a lot of activity regarding comets across the early Americas. And the exhibition has examples from New England to Lima, through Mexico and Bahia in Brazil, of people fighting over the meaning of the meanings of comets, whether comets are to be feared or not, or they are just things that are there up in the sky. And another interesting thing I just like to briefly comment upon is that, especially in Mexico, there was a lot of activity related to comets. I mean, activity printed results of this disputes, and it's fantastic because there are several woman printers involved in this. So this would take us back to the questions about print culture that we were talking about a little while ago.
I was just reading a question in the chat about authorship, and I think it can be connected with those disputes, the reasons for those disputes, and the woman printers as well. So as Thomás was saying, in Mexico, really from the mid 17th century, but especially in 1681 up to 1690, there were many publications on the apparition of comets, on the meaning of comets. The very act of putting through the press a discourse about a comet is an authorial statement. Authorship is what's at stake here, because opinions circulated. They mostly circulated, we think, and we and other scholars in university contexts. But there was a question of rivalry, and print was sort of the outcome of the competition. And the authors of these discourses shaped themselves as different types of authors. Now, the wider issue is that it was mostly one or two women printers that put these through the press. So they must have also had something to do in the making of this product as a commercial product that had an audience. And then authorship also needs to be thought of from that perspective.
Great, thank you, Nydia, for catching that question about authorship and legitimacy. So I'm going to throw out three other questions and then give each of you about a minute and a half to answer, and then we'll close things up there to not extend too far. The first was a question from Paula Uparella asking about a contra-colonial perspective and whether the astronomical observations in the Americas may have triggered or contributed to epistemological or scientific or technological advances in Europe rather than the opposite, which is normally the story that we hear from Europe moving out to the Americas. Another question from Paolo Bertucci about the relationship between inscription and deception, and whether there are examples of inscriptions created to intentionally deceive. And then finally, from actually it disappeared, but it was from Bob Westman, related to whether there was an almanac tradition, an indigenous almanac tradition, and if so, what that might have consisted of. So if you want to use this as an opportunity to sort of say a few final remarks and responding to whichever part of those three questions appealed, go ahead. Why don't we begin with Nydia, then Thomás, and then end with Simon.
I was just thinking of how early the indigenous almanacs, and Simon has already answered. There are Mayan almanacs from at least the 11th century. I think that's the earliest. It's also interesting to think of the colonial almanacs, the colonial indigenous almanacs that take on new forms, like the Tovar Codex that Simon showed us. There, the months are presented in veintenas, in the periods of 20 days, and each month has a page in the manuscript. And so that's a very interesting hybrid genre and moment of construction of that hybridity.
I'm just gonna comment on the question of whether things that were happening in the Americas triggered epistemological debates in Europe. I would say that certainly so. For instance, this, which is already a well-established question, the meaning of the American skies, particularly the southern skies, and were they different? Did they act differently, or were their influences over human affairs different from the northern skies? This is a well-known and very important story, but I think our exhibition also wants to highlight that astronomical phenomena triggered very important debates in the Americas, independently from what was happening to Europe, or independently from our being or not being part of the big narrative of the scientific revolution and things like this. There was so much activity here and so much debate, and astronomy was everywhere, including in including the most philosophical circles and universities and so on. But it was also part of everyday people's lives. So I think this is partly what this exhibition is about, trying to tell stories or histories of astronomy in the Americas in their own terms.
Well, most of these issues will be being discussed, let's not forget the future, on the 20th and 30th of November and on the 8th of December, when the organizers have recruited an absolutely remarkable group of real experts. I'm the pseudo one here. So if you want an example, Paula, of an inscription that is actually fraudulent, you've just experienced one. You have, after all, to look forward to Franco Rossi and Miruna Achim and people like that who really and truly know the answers to these questions. Two short thoughts. One, in a way that's extremely familiar, and I think the exhibition brings out marvelously, the very notion that there was something called European or Old World astronomy is the result of the work that's on show in this exhibition. It's not that, first of all, there was, as it were, a self-conscious notion of an advanced, hyper-legitimate form of astral science based in Western and Northern Europe, and then it gets exported to and is debated here in Mexico City or Lima or Havana or Providence. That's exactly how that was defined. And in particular, if you look at some of the most local texts around astronomy that are in the exhibition, including Benjamin West's absolutely amazing report on the observations of the transit of Venus made round the corner from where you now are in June of 1769, what he's doing there, apart from all the other things he's doing, is to define the connection and the distinction between astronomy being done in Rhode Island and astronomy being done in London. And he does both of those things in that text, just like Benjamin Banneker. So I think one of the most striking things about this amazing exhibition is how much people who do not have the good fortune to live in the Americas have to learn from it, because we know nothing. And I'm be excited to come back to it. And I hope everybody else, all 101 of you, will do that too. And thanks a million.
Wonderful, Simon. Well, thank you very, very deeply. On behalf of everybody at the library, let me take the moment to thank Nydia and Thomás for being exemplary curators of this exhibition and all of the associated events and activities, which, as Simon alluded to, will be taking place November 30th with a really wonderful cast of scholars and friends of the library. December 8th in Spanish, there will be a Portuguese language event taking place, hopefully in January. If there's one thing that astronomical events did in the early modern period as today, they united people around the globe in their observation. And as we work our way through this very bizarre moment that we're all living through, I think it's wonderful to have moments like this where we can actually gather around a virtual exhibition and with wonderful presenters to really guide us through. And it's been a spectacular, spectacular time, and really want to thank everybody who came and everybody who participated for your engagement and enthusiasm. So whatever time it may be, wherever you are, I hope you will join us for a virtual toast to this wonderful exhibition. Please go and visit, and please let us know how you found it as the constellations turn before you. Thanks to everybody. Signing off now.